Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Shazad and Kareem, for kicking off the mornings in such an interesting fashion. I don't need to introduce us, in fact, because Shazad has done the job for us. But Miguel, welcome to the stage and welcome to the hot seat. It's great to have you here. Thank you for coming all the way from New York. So you and I worked together in Brussels probably 15 years ago now, and you've had a fantastic...
Long time ago.
It is, I know, we're getting old, but you've had a fantastic and very varied career since then. So tell us a little bit about your career and what led you to your current role at the UN.
Well, my career is a long succession of accidents, actually, because I never had a plan of a career. So I finished law school and I did my quasi-slavery period in a law firm because I really thought it was important to qualify as a lawyer. So I did my civil law, criminal law, administrative law like everybody else. That it was very important because it formatted my brain as a lawyer. And I think it gave me something also very important, which is the client mentality, the notion that you have to provide for a service to someone, which is not usually part of the mental functioning of civil servants, but it's important to be there. And then I was briefly in politics, which was helpful to understand the needs of a political master. And, you know, also it put me before important tests like negotiating with trade unions of dockers, for instance, who can really paralyze your country. So it's really tough, but it makes you create certain skills. And then I was in Europe with you, and then the 9-year period I was in Brussels was a great school, a great introduction to the United Nations in the sense that it's real multilateralism. And we were pretty young, but, but the fact that you're there negotiating actually legislation which applies to your own country gives you a sense of responsibility and of focus that I think it's very helpful for your professional life. And also it makes you negotiate internally with your own authorities because, you know, the Foreign Office is a soft power ministry and we have to talk with the big boys, so in the beagles in the Ministry of Finance and Justice and Home and Interior Affairs. Those are the really powerful ministries, and we have to learn how to discuss and negotiate with all these people. And the last beautiful accident after being in Lisbon as legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was to be pushed by some colleagues to apply for this job, and it worked, and here I am, 9 years. Still very happy with the job, in spite of all the frustrations, but still believing that I have one of the most interesting legal jobs in the world,
That's wonderful to hear, and yeah, it does sound fantastic. So tell us a bit more about what you do day to day. What do you and your team do? Okay,
so we have, it's a large team, not that large for the needs, but we have 200 people. And we basically provide legal services to the entire system, meaning other departments. So it can be my colleague who is in charge of humanitarian affairs or political affairs, to the Secretary General of the United Nations, of course, and that's my main role, but also to the President of the General Assembly, and also try to keep a very close relationship with member states. And I have a very strong member state culture because maybe also I'm coming from that side. So I've invested a lot of time in, you know, developing a network of contacts with member states. And then it's more the way you work, you know. So what I've asked from my team is that we're not comfortably sitting at our desks waiting for a request for legal advice to arrive. Actually, we try to be implicated as soon as possible in all the different decision-making processes in the United Nations at all different levels. So that's a lot of work because, in fact, you spend too much time in meetings, but it's a good investment in the sense that it helps you, you know, it helps you explaining to your colleagues what may be the flaws of a certain decision. So in a way, you can influence the decision to a place where you think it's more correct legally. And it creates solidarity because, you know, the role of the lone lawyer who is sitting at his desk in his little ivory tower and then sends an opinion saying it's good, it's bad. It doesn't work like that anymore. So you have to work in solidarity with your colleagues, trying to fix their problems. And of course, you'll ask the same in exchange. And that it's just more work, but it makes it more dynamic. I'm also very lucky because I have an excellent team, which I think I helped change and create. And because it's a very old office, which was created across the plaza in the Methodist Hall, which was the place of the first session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, was in London. And in one of the first resolutions, it was the Office of Legal Affairs was created, 13 February 1946. So it gets easier when you have such a good corporate culture. It gives you additional responsibilities, but it makes your life easier.
Thank you. I recognise all of that. Is there a difference advising an international organisation compared with advising a national government?
Yes, I think so, and I'm going to ask you the same question. But, well, when you're dealing with one government, you're in principle dealing with one policy and one political orientation, which, you know, can also be informed by the politics or the policies of your most direct partners. Like, for my country, you will take into account what's going on in the European Union or in NATO and so on. When you transfer this experience to an international organization like the United Nations, we have 193 states, not 28, but 193. So yes, you have to be aware, inform, and educate yourself about the political complexity of the organization, the diversity of clients, and you have to learn also something about cultural diversity. So you do not exchange and discuss with a British in the same way you discuss and exchange with a Chinese national or an Argentinian or whatever. So it gives you really a global vision of how the world works, how the different states interact, how the different interests inform political discussions. So it's a different job, a very interesting one, but it's a fundamentally different role. What about you, Sally? What would you say are the main differences?
Ooh. Well, I've not been a legal advisor to an international organisation, only to a government and then representing my government. But I can tell you about how I approach how I see the job. So in my mind, I am a lawyer, but I'm also an official and a civil servant. So my job, and I think the job of every government lawyer, is to help the government of the day to deliver its policy within the law. So I think the first job of a government lawyer is to know where are the boundaries of the law. So where is it, they should not go beyond. And often that space is surprisingly large. And then within the space that is lawful, then the job is to help the policy colleagues and the ministers to deliver their policy and to design it in a legally smart way. We obviously need to point out to them the big risks, and we need to know which are the big and the small risks so that we don't overdo the small risks. But we need to help them to get their policy in a proportionate way. And I think often, the way that we do the advice in the UK government is we offer risk-based advice, so we point out what is there, positive, negative. We help our colleagues on the policy and political side to take the decisions. So we advise, they decide. I guess we need to know when to get out of the way, because actually the legal problems and legal issues are not necessarily material, so we shouldn't be front and centre, and we need to know when it is that we need to be absolutely up there at the top table speaking truth to power, and we need not to shirk from that. So all in all, it's an interesting job, and I think one that you never get to the end of in terms of learning how to do it well.
It's a very good description. I mean, I generally agree with all these these elements, yeah.
Generally agree. Do you disagree?
No. Listen, everybody has a different personality, and the same job, we're gonna do it differently according to our personality. So you have personalities that are more risk-averse, people that are more bold. Bold doesn't mean crazy, okay? People who have more difficulties in talking to a political master, and so you cannot really look at the job and imagine that everybody's going to do it in the same way, and that's good. You have to put some of yourself and some of your personality in the job you're doing.
I agree with that, and I think it goes back to what you said about working in a team.
Yeah.
Different personalities, different skills. It's a team sport, isn't it, what we do?
Absolutely.
Let's move on to the UN as an institution. I was going to ask you, what is the role of the UN in the current global world and in times of emergency?
Wow. For what, 10
Briefly.
minutes? Or?
Briefly, 1 minute.
1 minute, that's difficult. Listen, it's not easy to talk about the UN in the current situation that we live in, of course. But I think one way to describe it is what the Secretary General said coming out of one session of the Security Council, a recent one, which was particularly frustrating. And then in front of the television cameras, he just explained, you know, the United Nations, it's much more than the chamber behind me, okay? So this is to say we're very, very concerned, disturbed even by the current crisis in peace and security that we live in. But the United Nations is not only the Security Council and peace and security issues. So the same day, we started immediately discussing with our humanitarian and security colleagues, humanitarian assistance, evacuation of people, distribution of food, you know, things that are really basic to ensure life conditions, you know. And then the Secretary General got very implicated and is still very implicated in the grain export initiative through Ukrainian ports because, you know, he was very concerned by the fact that these, the way the war is affecting food production, and our colleagues in FAO were very alarmed because the World Food Index prices were going to, I mean, absolutely amazing levels, the highest since Second World War. And this affects African countries, the Middle East, and the small farmers who don't have fertilizers and so on and so on. So that was something that he has devoted a lot of energy. Also is currently now studying the possibility of exporting fertilizers of Russian origin to help agricultures in Africa and so on. This is just to tell it doesn't stop, and it's very broad. So part of this work is being done with UNCTAD, with my colleague Rebecca Greenspan. We need the support of FAO. You know that the International Atomic Agency was very recently in Zaporizhia and is still there with some technical inspection. So the system starts moving immediately. And we much broader than the Security Council. So this is my basic message.
It's certainly a very complex organization and a lot to keep track of. I wanted to ask you if the relationship between the different UN organs and institutions is changing at the moment.
Well, it seems so, but we have to also be careful in this type of very quick analysis because we still don't have the necessary distance to look from this phenomenon a little bit en recul, as the French would say. You have a more assertive General Assembly, that's for sure. And you have a more, I'm sorry to say, inefficient Security Council. So institutions tend to find the balance, and you know, throughout the years that we have worked in Brussels, we are also familiar with the fights between Commission and Council. And the General Assembly has been using some prerogatives, and I'm going to give you an example, for instance, the creation of the Syrian mechanism. And it's an original piece of, legislation. It's a quasi-criminal investigation body, but it basically is an answer to the paralysis of the Security Council in dealing with the extremely grave situation that we have all seen in television. I mean, and so it's a new thing, and it was a very interesting development. It made some members of the Security Council very, very angry. And I have different requests from one particular permanent member of the Security Council asking me to declare how illegal it is for the General Assembly to do something like that, which obviously I'm not going to do because it's not for the Legal Council of the United Nations to assess the legality of the acts of the Parliamentary Assembly. But you see the clash that is taking place. Another very interesting aspect, and this is more political than legal, is I think the election of the last Secretary General. So the fact that all the candidates, and there were quite a few, had to go before the General Assembly and ask questions and make a presentation, it just totally changes the political dynamic of the process. So no norms or no new norms were created or no old norms were changed. But the question is, would the Security Council be able to appoint someone who has performed very poorly before the General Assembly? I mean, politically. So this changes a little bit the dynamics of the entire process in ways that we have to see how they develop. And I think the last interesting development is the veto discussions. And they're discussing that right now in New York. So I don't know what is the exact, or what will be the exact outcome of the discussion. But I'm very curious to see how this process will be organized, if it happens, because, one of the members of the Security Council, particularly if he's a permanent member, who is asked to explain his veto before the General Assembly. Let's see how this process ends. But this is a very interesting development also. So yes, you have a more assertive General Assembly, and let's see how this develops in the future.
Yeah, I think we would agree with that analysis. It makes me think that it's quite interesting and important for you as the legal counsel to sort out what is about legitimacy in politics from what is legal. Is it always easy to tell the difference between those questions?
For me, it is, because I am also member of the decision-making bodies in the United Nations, so I have a policy role because I'm a member of the executive committee, which is more or less the board of the United Nations, and of the chief executive board, which is, the entity where all the heads of the different specialized agencies meet. So I have a policy role, and I'm not shy about it. I actually like to discuss policy issues. And in my brain, I can very, very easily separate both. And it actually helps me in my job as legal counsel to have a policy role. First, because I can try to influence the decision in a certain way. Second, because it also creates a lot of solidarity between the lawyer and its colleagues. And, there are a few red lines. I never compromise on principles. And this is the main thing a lawyer has to keep in mind. But often you can help your colleagues define second-best solutions. And it's what you said that was very interesting, that actually the political space is much broader than it looks, and within that space to find appropriate solutions. So it helps me in my job to have I don't find it difficult at all. There was a school of thinking, mostly in the United States, about general counsels of big corporations, that they should not have at all a policy role. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's actually it helps our job as the lawyers to have a policy role and to understand the needs of our colleagues in the different sectors of their mandates. So,
thank you. So I wanted to focus in for a minute on the sixth committee of the General Assembly, which deals with legal affairs, so obviously of interest to people in this room. I'm coming to my first sixth committee in 2 weeks' time, 2 or 3 weeks' time. So tell me what I can expect. What work is there? What's of importance?
Okay, so let me know when you arrive so I can invite you for at least for a coffee.
Thank you.
So you can expect very many extremely boring sessions.
Okay, let's go for coffee during those. Yeah.
Now, now more seriously. I mean, the Sixth Committee should be one of the main places where you make international law. But in the recent years, not much has came out of it. And that is a bit frustrating for me. You know, I said against the advice of my assistants, which I tend very often to disrespect, I did say before the Sixth Committee in one session that I expected it to be more than the graveyard of the International Law Commission drafts. So, and it has become a little bit like that, you know. So they have their regular program with their regular exchanges, some of them more interesting than others, but in terms of lawmaking, it has not been doing much. I don't want to go too much into the detail of the current discussions because they're happening, and you know the Legal Counsel of the United Nations has to be a bit sober and not opine directly on things that member states are discussing. But there is a big discussion taking place now, or which has you'll probably be part of that when you are in New York, about the future of the draft on crimes against humanity. You know, there was a parallel discussion a few years ago about the draft on state responsibility and what do member states want to do about these. So I'll just probably go down for a couple of sessions. I don't have any work in the Sixth Committee other than open it and close it, which I like very much. So I'll probably sit in a couple of those sessions listening to all the interesting things that, that member states are going to say, and in particular see what they're gonna do about this draft on crimes against humanity. I'm very curious to see what decisions member states will take about this.
Thank you. I'm interested in that too. The UK has co-sponsored a resolution to get that moving in the committee, so it's certainly on our radar. And
very good. And I'm very interested because it may create precedent in a way. So I'm curious to see what is going to happen.
Me too. It'll be good. Let's move on to Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, one of the emergencies of the moment, though by no means the only crisis, important crisis that needs action in the world. So we've heard from Karim this morning on the work of the ICC. What is the role of the UN here? Tell us about what you and your team are doing in this space.
You mean specifically Russia-Ukraine criminal accountability or in general?
More in general.
Okay. Well, more in general, and since the 24th February, which was the day of the invasion, and you know, it was a really strange moment because I was in the Security Council chamber sitting behind the Secretary General, and it was really a surprise, a bad surprise. So you're sitting there with the feeling that you're living an historic moment, I mean, a moment I will not forget, and understanding that something fundamental has changed. Okay, so you will have to operate in a different set of mind from that date. Now, the priority, and this is very much the way I work with the Secretary General as well, was to help the Secretary General prepare his political statements. And I hope that you all have noticed, because I assume that everyone in this room has a particular interest for international law, that there was a very strong component of law in those statements and a very clear characterization of the situation under international law. But to get there, and in these sensitive moments, every word needs to be measured and discussed. So that's a lot of work in itself. It's the more political work. And then we started immediately working with all the colleagues in humanitarian corridors, And this looks very basic, but in order to establish a humanitarian corridor, you need to negotiate with both parties, Ukraine and Russia, and then while talking to these different parties, there are some aspects that you absolutely have to take into account, because you cannot, be seen as implicitly recognizing the authority of the occupying power. I mean, there's a lot of details, and then the priority, and that there was a lot of work during summer, and we really never disconnected. Even when we are on holidays, you have to check your emails very occasionally, but a lot of work in the grain initiative, and also to get there, you need a lot of different complicated instruments, and we're now providing some legal assistance in this possible export of Russian fertilizers to outside Russia and so on. So it generates a lot of work, and I'm oversimplifying, and also some of the matters are confidential, so I wouldn't be able to give much detail about it. I have not been active in any work about accountability. That's first and foremost for member states to discuss and decide where they want to go. The Office of Legal Affairs and the United Nations in general, we have very high expertise on those matters, because we have now 25 years of international ad hoc tribunals. And it was very good to listen to Karim, that gave us an experience, in the sense that the statutes of most of these tribunals were drafted in our office. And I can say it because I was not there, so this was before me. But, ex-Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Lebanon, maybe a less successful experience. But there is some expertise there, and upon request, we're ready to participate in any processes. But I think that since the Rome Statute, the ICC should take this work. I think that there's not much appetite for new international ad hoc tribunals. I think there is some work that we can provide assistance in gathering evidence and so on. We work a lot with the ICC, of course, but they are on the lead in these matters, so we don't have a direct role so far.
Thank you. So just building on that, I was going to ask you how you see the different international organizations with their different focuses working together. As Karim has said, there's been a bit of a stampede. Everybody with an idea wanting to do something. How do you think it can be most efficiently organized?
Well, coordination, the United Nations is, the main value of the United Nations is being universal. Okay, this is the only organization where everybody sits. And this is very important. So it's very important, and it's very important that member states sit there talking a common language, which is the language of international law. So when you get a visit from the ambassador of North Korea, that happens very seldom, but it has happened twice in the last 9 years. So you have the representative of a country which is not entirely plugged into the international order, and it comes to develop an argument under international law, and that's very important. So the day we lose this, it will be a very bad day. The rest is cooperation. We have, within the United Nations, specific platforms to foster that cooperation and to avoid duplication, and to appeal to the different expertises. So I'm not going to talk about atomic energy. I know nothing about atomic energy, but my colleagues in Vienna in the agency, they are experts on that, or trade, or, you choose it. Or, and then cooperation with outside organizations. Because you mentioned the ICC, we have a cooperation agreement, United Nations and the ICC, and actually they generate a lot of work, interesting work, and a lot of it is invisible work, and has to remain invisible, is specific requests for cooperation. So I think cooperation is the key word.
Thank you. So I was going to ask you what we can do if the architecture of the Security Council is not working, and to that I will add a question that's come in from the floor, a rather direct question. One questioner says, Russia has been in breach of the Charter. I think most people agree that. Is it time to suspend it from the Security Council?
Well, is that a legal question? I mean, I don't have any doubts. I am comfortable saying that Russia has breached the Charter because that's what my Secretary General has said. So I try not to make autonomous legal statements, but I can contribute to prepare those legal statements. But once the Secretary General or the Security Council or the General Assembly have made a political statement, I'm comfortable because I can refer to that. So in that sense, it's totally and very well characterized by the Secretary General. It's a circular question because, to suspend the member state, at some point, you will need the intervention of the Security Council. So it's the egg and the chicken. So how are you going to solve that? Yes. In a few entities, and through their specific governance bodies, the issue of suspension of rights of the Russian Federation or expulsion has taken place or is taking place, okay? So, and we all know the cases. In the United Nations, so it's not exactly a legal question because, all the provisions tell that you would need the Security Council intervention. I would rather, politically, not legal, rather have this debate reminding the Russian Federation as a permanent member of the Security Council of its particular responsibilities as a permanent member to uphold the Charter. And that's why Article 24.3, if I'm not, I hate to quote provisions because you often make mistakes, says that the Security Council must discharge its functions in absolute respect with the principles and values of the Charter. So I think it's more a political issue. I don't like this idea of excluding members from the United Nations because, again, our most important asset is being universal. And if we have to preserve that at any cost.
Thank you. Well, going back to what we said about speaking truth to power,
yeah.
All power to your elbow as you give those messages. Let's maybe move on to other world challenges and problems. Let's talk about the environment for a moment. And obviously this is another crisis, if not an emergency, climate change. So we have the COP27 in November and then COP15 for the Convention on Biological Diversity in December. So how can the UN maintain its focus on climate change and the environment while also addressing Ukraine and all the other crises?
Yeah. So yesterday, actually I got late, so I only watched Antonio talking to Christine Chinkim, and they were talking about these crises and emergencies. For me, they didn't touch enough on the most existential crisis that we live in, which is anything related to the state of the planet. And yes, this is very important, Russia and Ukraine, we're all very disturbed, but this is a fundamental distraction of the main thing that we need to sit and discuss right now. And it's not only climate action, is oceans, and by the way, they are connected. For instance, every second breath we take has origin in the ocean. So the fact that we have a plastic pollution spot in the North Pacific, the size of France, and the loss of biodiversity, the deforestation, and this is the issues that we should really be talking about. They are existential. I think the next generation is going to hate us for the state we leave this planet. And the UN, for me, is the ideal platform to address these issues. And, other than the climate change and the COPs that you have every year, and you had one in Glasgow also, there is also, I mean, we're not in a very optimist period, none of us, but there is our positive agenda that is still moving. And for instance, in what concerns oceans, there is a new treaty being negotiated, which has a very long name, Biodiversity Beyond Areas of National Jurisdiction, but it actually means almost 70% of the ocean mass. And it has been going for a while. I'm very hopeful that the next session will conclude the treaty early next year. That would be a major step forward in this process of taking care of the planet, which I think is exactly where we're not doing enough. None of us, none of our politicians, none of our structures, and that's for me the most existential issue right now. More than peace and security issues.
Yeah, very important. As a parent of teenagers, I can certainly echo their voice and that of their friends and encourage you to keep going in that area. And also for the BBNJ negotiations.
Yeah, and other things, the UNEP, the environmental program is starting the discussion on plastic in the ocean, so things can be done, you know, and any of us who works in public affairs and particularly in international organizations have to believe that things can change. Otherwise it doesn't have any meaning, right? So you have to believe in positive change. Otherwise you sell insurance or you go to banking or something like that.
Yeah, a bit late for a career change maybe. I speak of myself. I think in a few minutes we'll open up the floor to questions, but before we do that, I was just going to ask you for a sort of concluding thought from you on the importance of international law and lawyers in our current day and age.
Well, we have a role, and I reason in terms of opposites. So international law is a fundamental component of a certain international order, and the opposite of that is international disorder. So it has a value in itself that member states still recognize even when they breach it. It's the common language that they have between themselves. And, you know, through all the crises and the doubts that some people have about, you know, the power or the existence of international law, we're very used to that. I remember that when I was in law school for all the traditional disciplines, civil law or commercial law, I heard professors saying, but international law is not really law. It's just something which is there. But, and yesterday there were some suggestions of that in the conversation that, you know, people still analyze it in terms of compliance. So you don't comply, therefore it doesn't exist, which is the same you could say for any law, like murders are committed, but it's still a crime to kill someone, so it doesn't make sense. But for me, nowadays, I think it's imperfect, it's recent historically, just 2 or 3 centuries, so we have to keep developing it. And the reply to all the current crises is more international law and not less international law. So, of course, we tend to analyze all these things through our life cycle and what is more immediate around us, but we have to reason in historical terms. A lot has been done after Second World War, which was like the biggest development of international law in the last 2 or 3 centuries. Even in the 90s, which were very specific, this global optimism period, we could develop a lot of new aspects of international law. International criminal justice is the obvious example. So there is work to do. International law can do it, and there is a role more and more intense for cooperation between member states, which is finally translated into norms. And of course, we lawyers, we like norms. What we try to explain to diplomats is that for us, norms is what is sustainable, what remains, what is there, right? What stands the test of time.
Thank you. So I'm hearing resolve, if not optimism, there. Right, let's take a question or two from the floor. I can see just here.
Thank you. Marco Longobardo, University of Westminster. I have a very specific question on a legal issue pertaining to the UN. 10 years ago, the UN Security Council created an exceptional unit within the peacekeeping mission in the DRC, within MONUSCO, called the Intervention Brigade, with offensive functions. And the Security Council was very clear in saying this is something exceptional, this doesn't create a precedent, we fully comply with the principles of peacekeeping. Now that we are about to celebrate the 10th birthday of this exceptional mission that has been an active force in hostilities in the DRC, I was wondering if you had the opportunity, your office had the opportunity to provide legal advice on whether the traditional principles of peacekeeping would have been respected, would have survived the intervention brigade in DRC. Thank you very much.
I'll go one after it's easier, so I don't get distracted by the second and the third question.
Yeah,
yes, of course we have. I never provide instant legal advice, so don't ask me for legal advice on stage because no responsible lawyer will give you. But yes, we were very active in that discussion, which is, by the way, the discussion, what is the measure of military force that can be used in peacekeeping and in the last generation of peacekeeping operations, which are the robust peacekeeping, okay? And the Force Intervention Brigade, I know I made a point of visiting almost all the peacekeeping operations because I like to discuss with the military. By the way, we work surprisingly well with the military structures, but also to have a clear idea, what are we doing? You know, because when you are in New York sitting in your office, what does this mean locally to my colleagues in the field? So I visited there. It's, you know, the legal question starts with the text of the Security Council resolution establishing that peacekeeping operation. So the language that is used there will determine what measure of military offensive force would be used. And then in the exercise of that activity, you have to take, say, certain precautions, and you have to, you know, define and design certain rules around the way you use that military force. And I have to tell you that our office was particularly involved in we designed actually the human rights due diligence policy. So, you know, the way the United Nations peacekeeping forces relate to outside partners, national armies, and so on. So it's a well-established question. It was a very interesting piece of legal work, which started before I arrived in the UN. It has continued, but I would say that and the international law is a settled issue. There are not many legal doubts about that. Did I reply to your? No?
maybe for the coffee break.
Maybe for the coffee break.
For a follow-up. Okay, let's take one more from the floor, and then I think it will be time for coffee. So just over here.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed for the conversation this morning. Simon Smith from the Commonwealth Development Office, War Crimes and International Justice Team. The UN institutions create a plethora of investigative mechanisms, COIs, IIIMs, IIMs. Mm-hmm. What would be your view if a proposal was going to establish a standing independent mechanism? We see so many of these mechanisms that get ambitious mandates and often not the resources to be able to fulfill them. And I do wonder if it would be possible to have sort of one mechanism that would, one, cut costs, I would imagine, and also make better use of the expertise that is available.
Yeah. Well, I think that you have to wait for results. So we have three right now, and we have been involved in the creation of the three mechanisms. Syria, Iraq for the crimes against Daesh. That was the first UN job of the current prosecutor, Karim, as he has just explained, and Myanmar. But they're more or less recent. So first we have to wait for results, see what they're doing, and which purpose are they serving. So all this gathering of evidence and preservation of evidence and expertise, this is that is being created is going to serve what? It's going to serve national prosecutions, international prosecutions. So let's assess first the results of this process before we start thinking of anything new. And I think they are in different stages of completion of their work, and some of them, actually only one of them has started cooperating, or two of them, sorry, has started cooperating with national prosecutions. Of course, I cannot give you the details of this, but in order to create a more permanent body that would do this type of functions, my first question would be, what is the relation with the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC? Because, you know, member states are not very keen in creating international tribunals, and I understand, and actually it makes sense. The same would apply to these quasi-judicial investigative mechanisms. Is it a double emploi with what the ICC is doing? Because the ICC now is becoming truly a very broad institution. You have 130 member states, 20, something like that. It's creating this momentum. And yeah, I mean, I think that the analysis has to be a result-based analysis. Is it good? Is it creating anything that serves effective prosecutions in national or international jurisdictions? And if the answers are no, 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 it's what is the point then? Other than historical memory, which can be very important also. So some of the work that these entities are doing will not ultimately lead to any specific prosecution, but the fact that this memory is preserved on a professional manner, it's also very important. It serves a social purpose. That was very important in Cambodia, for instance. And it helped, I think, but again, this is not an analysis that lawyers can do alone. We have to work with other professionals, but I think, for instance, in Cambodia, all this work has helped the healing process of an entire society, which faced a huge tragedy. So, but again, I think we have to wait for results and assess that at a later stage.
Thanks, Miguel. I think we need to leave it there because
there was a question from the Supreme Court, which...
Lady Arden. I'm going to presume on the tea break if you can make it really quick, and Miguel, really quick in the answer, then we will conclude the session on that. But please go for it. If you'd like to take it, yeah.
Very quick question, because you mentioned oceans, and we know that the Commonwealth has done a lot of work on oceans because it has 1/3 of the coastal states who are greatly jeopardized by what's happening with climate change. And I just wondered if you could give us some insight on the weight which the work done by the Commonwealth has in the United Nations measures.
Yeah. No, I mean, all these platforms, we keep a constant dialogue. The Commonwealth, the Pacific Island Forum, so. And actually, it's not such a large community of people who are devoted to oceans and the protection of environment. So yes, there are regular contacts. I am aware of all the work being done in the Commonwealth fora. And it's a cooperative, it's very much a cooperative relation that is effective, you know, so.
Great. I suspect we could go on through the whole coffee break, and apologies to those people who've sent in questions online that we haven't got to. I suggest you form a queue at the coffee table.
But I still want my coffee.
To talk to Miguel as soon as he's got his coffee. Miguel, thank you so much for speaking so frankly to us.
Yeah.
It's been a great pleasure to have you here.